George Valdez, a young man in his 20s, driven by insatiable thirst for money, climbs the ranks of one of Colombia's largest drug cartels. As the director of U.S. operations for the cartel, he met presidents, he met politicians. This is not surprising you, of course, right? He met Hollywood celebrities, generals, paid killers, kidnappers, and then he encountered Jesus Christ and was saved. I had a friend who shared the gospel with a priest in a Hindu temple, a temple that was practicing human sacrifice. He would do what he called Jericho walks around the temple, and he eventually led the Hindu priest to Christ. We love stories like that, dramatic stories. And we have stories in this room. There's stories sitting in here right now. I've heard many of them. We have people who have been, since they've been children, who have trusted Christ from a young age. They don't even know a time when they haven't known Christ. We have teenagers and college students, and maybe some of you who are adults have this story, where all of a sudden it was like, I woke up. I didn't know what they were telling me, and then one day all of a sudden it mattered. We have adults in this room who've been delivered from addiction, who've been delivered from marital strife, who've been delivered from strife with their children. We have adults in this room who have been delivered from all sorts of things, and all of us come into this room and we say things like, God did it, God rescued me, God healed me, God redeemed me, God brought me out of the pit, amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. There are probably 300 stories or so in this room right now of people who have been redeemed. But what are Christians supposed to do with those stories? Like, do we just kind of hold them into ourselves? Do we recount them kind of like verbatim? And that's what happens here now in Acts 22. How do we communicate the story God has essentially weaved into our life? So the Apostle Paul is going to retell an event that we've already read about in Acts chapter 9. And this is, wouldn't you agree with me? This is probably the most well-known conversion in the history of the world. This is the most read conversion in the world. This is the most told conversion of the world. This is an example that people follow in terms of retelling their own story. This is a story that is just studied because it dramatically changed the history of the world. This is the conversion story. But here's the thing about the conversion story, he changes it. He doesn't tell the same story that we get from Acts chapter 9. So this whole thing starts in Acts 21. He rolls into Jerusalem. People know that he's there. People have heard that he is teaching the Gentiles, you don't have to follow the law in order to be saved. There's a rumor going around, he has taught the Jews also. He comes into the temple to pay a Nazaritic vow to help 4 people do it because the Jerusalem church puts him up to it. And he gets recognized by a Jew from Ephesus who's in Jerusalem, and a riot starts. And he's beaten. The Roman soldiers rush in. They carry him out. This is the end of Acts chapter 21. And at the end of Acts 21, he goes, excuse me, can I talk to the people who just beat me? That's Acts 22. And so for the next few chapters, Paul's going to be speaking a lot. These are going to be speeches. And we're going to have to do it thematically. If I just go verse by verse of every single one of these speeches, Acts is never going to end. And we have to eventually stop with Acts. So I'm just going to recount his story. And then I want to talk about his courage. And then I want to talk about his strategy. That's it. The story that he tells, that he's going to tell one other time in the book of Acts. And then his courage that he has in the face of a lot of opposition. And then the strategy. And I say strategy because he changes what Luke says happens in Acts chapter 9. Okay, here's his story. Acts 22, he's telling it now, and you can get it from Acts 9, you can get it from Galatians 1, you can get it from Philippians 3. Here it is, verse 3. I am a Jew. I was born in Tarsus. I was brought up in this city. I studied under Gamaliel. I was thoroughly trained in the law of my ancestors. I was just as zealous of God as you are today. I persecuted the church. I was throwing them in prison. I got papers. I went down to Damascus. So who is Paul? He's a Jew. He studied under Gamaliel, thoroughly trained, zealous for God. Philippians 3 says, tribe of Benjamin, Hebrew of Hebrews, advancing beyond many of his own age. So Paul is going to set up his testimony like this. Here's my life before I encountered Jesus. And then he's going to say, okay, here's what happened when I encountered him, and then here's what happened after. And many people have kind of followed that pattern when they talk about, well, this is what God's done in my life. So what is Paul before he's a Christian? Well, I was a Jew. I was in Cilicia. I grew up. I was trained under the top guy. I was zealous. I persecuted the church. And the takeaway is that there's no amount of religious zeal that will save a person. Paul did everything right. Studied, religious observance. He says he was blameless. The tribe of Benjamin, that's the tribe that doesn't, pull away from David and his descendants. That's the tribe that remained loyal. He's the man who was zeal for the law. Philippians calls him blameless. Can you imagine walking into a place like, as far as it concerns the law of God, I am blameless in following it and actually believe it. He's a Hebrew of Hebrews, which means he had a godly family. So he's got everything you would want in a religious figure, and he's following it, and he is zealous, and he thinks of himself essentially as like a big stick in God's hand, right? Like he's so zealous that he's like, and I'm going to serve him, and I'm going to serve him as the big stick, and I'm going to punish everybody. And so how does he describe himself? I am a persecutor, or was. And when we first meet Paul, that's what he is. And that kind of identity is what is in his mind at all times. He says it here in verse 5. He says it in verse 19 and 20. Lord, I replied, and this is actually an argument that Paul has with God, go figure. These people know that I went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believe in you. And then the blood of the martyr Stephen was shed, and I stood there giving my approval and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. In his psyche, he is one thing. He's a persecutor. I think most people who have become Christians, they kind of have a catchphrase for what they were before Christ. And you see that. Have you seen cardboard testimonies before? People come up onto the stage, and on one side they wrote what they were, and then on the other side they say what they are now. So they could be like, I was addicted to pornography. And then they flip it and they go, freed by the blood of Christ. Next person comes up and says, I was an alcoholic. They flip it. I'm free because of the blood of Christ. Then the next person comes up. I was super religious. I came to church every week. Flip it around. And then my eyes were open because I didn't believe any of it. What is Paul's one phrase to describe who he was before he was a Christian? I was a persecutor. He was at Stephen's death. He's destroying churches. He's going house to house. So he's not like, I'm threatening you. He is kind of going through on his commitment. So it's not like, I'm going to get you. Sometimes we say to our kids, like, don't do that and I'll whatever, but you're really not getting off the couch because you're tired. No. Paul's getting off the couch, and he's willing to travel 150 miles round trip, which is essentially 1 month of travel, to go up to Damascus to snuff out this group who says Jesus is Lord. Paul's a bloody man. He is a violent man. He is a zealous man. Verse 19 and 20 is interesting. Just look down at it. He essentially tells God he can't do what God has told him to do because of his past. There is a group of Christians, I think, that I often run into that feel so much shame about their past that they tell God, hey, I can't serve you because of what I was. That's Paul. Lord, you know what I did. I can't do that. And God turns to him and says, I'm the one who decides. This is my paraphrase, the Darren Message version of the book of Acts. Don't argue with me, son. Your shame does not disqualify you from what God has told you to do. Your past does not disqualify you from what God has told you to do. In fact, God is going to use Paul in a very specific way to go after the very people that he persecuted. And you see that in Christians' lives all the time, especially with adults where they've had some life behind them and they've just had some things happen to them and things they've done. And God then uses all that stuff that they feel shame about to actually qualify for them for what they're going to do going forward. That's before Christ. I am a persecutor. And then the encounter, sovereign intervention. And people talk about that when they convert, especially as adults, like, what happened? And they go, I'm not sure. Well, Paul is, verse 6, about noon I came near Damascus. Suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed all around. So blinding light is kind of a feature when God shows up. So, Jesus resurrects, right? And he's walking around with the disciples. No one is like overwhelmed by his presence. No one is sheer light. They're not like falling down at his feet. They see him as a man. But for some reason, when he ascends into heaven, any interaction with Jesus after that is overwhelming, bright light, everyone falling on the face, unable to speak. And so that's Paul. Bright light, middle of the day. It knocks him to the ground. And then a voice. I fell to the ground, verse 7, and I heard a voice. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? So he gets knocked to the ground. He gets asked a question by Jesus, and his response is, Lord, who are you? Or it could be translated, Sir, who are you? Why does he say that? He says that because he doesn't know who he is. Jesus isn't a category for him to believe yet. And then, oh, surprise, Paul, I'm Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. Now, Acts 9, Luke doesn't say of Nazareth. It just says Jesus. Paul adds the line for the crowd, and we'll get to that later. Surprise, Saul, verse 8. All right, so you're persecuting Christians, you're persecuting Jesus. Jesus becomes the litmus test for zeal. Paul is zealous, but it is misguided and wrong. So, verse 10, what shall I do, Lord? Man, what a great question. I feel like lately that's all I pray. But you want to know how when conversion takes place in someone's life? When they genuinely ask the Lord, what now? You want me to give up blank? Okay. You want me to move? Okay. You want me to stay? Okay. Want me to stay in a job that's terrible for the sake of witness? Okay. You want me to treat someone differently? Okay. You want me to spend my money in different ways? Okay. You know when someone is converted when they just ask the question, what do you want from me? And then they do it. One of the things about conversion is that you end up with a God who can disagree with you. And I like to ask people that sometimes, like, when's the last time God disagreed with you? When's the last time you had an argument with him and you were wrong? That's how you know you haven't created a God in your own image, a God that just agrees with you every time you say something to him. Yeah, God's a yes, and he's a yes. And, oh, you're like that. He's like, oh, yes, I am. And you just kind of make things up. What shall I do, Lord? And Jesus, verse 10, classic Jesus, he doesn't tell him. Just go to Damascus, and you will be told what to do there. This is classic Christian life. I'm not going to tell you what the future holds. Do you trust me? Go do this one thing. That's the Christian life. He goes, he meets Ananias. He's not expecting to meet this guy. Ananias obeys God, walks into the house, lays hands on Saul, and says, Brother Saul. Family language, beautiful moment. Language of forgiveness. Do you think that Saul had the letters from the chief priest in his pocket still when Ananias walks in and says, Hi, Brother Saul? Do you think Ananias knew the people that Saul killed? Do you think he knew the widows as a result of Saul's murder? Do you think he knew Stephen? Of course he did. And here he is putting his hands on this guy and saying, Hi, brother. I mean, it's not like Southern Baptist, you don't know his name. Like, this is real. Like, give me a hug. Hey, brother, Saul. And then he baptizes him. What are you waiting for? Get up, be baptized, and wash your sins away. I mean, what are you waiting for is like a great question. It's a rhetorical question. He's not supposed to answer. He's not supposed to say, oh, actually, I'm not worthy of it. Actually, I need to get my life in order. Actually, it's not the right timing. Nothing like that. When he says, what are you waiting for? He means, let's go. There's water. We're doing this right now. Ananias is saying to Saul, this is legit. So Saul's not just deciding, hey, I'm going to get baptized today. The church is looking at him and being like, oh, you are legit. You are a Christian. We actually think you are, and we're going to baptize you. And so you see this life before, this famous story. I am a persecutor. I murdered people. I killed people. I had an encounter with Jesus. That encounter with Jesus included blinding light, a voice from heaven, Ananias putting his hands on me, calling me brother, baptizing me. And then, what is his life after Christ? Mission. Go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles. So he does mention an event where he comes back into Jerusalem in verse 17 and 18, but then in verse 21, he essentially summarizes his entire life going forward is, I am now on mission to share the gospel with the Gentiles. That's the story. It's an example for us. Can you tell yours? What happened before Christ? What happened when I encountered him? What's it been like after? Now the courage. Have you ever been in an intense situation? You ever been in a situation with crowds? You know, everyone's IQ goes down about 30 points when you get into a crowd. You ever been at a, say, Bobcat game when a ref makes a call that you may not appreciate? Why are you booing? Did you see it? Do you have like this expertise in refereeing? And you know, everyone's complaining and everyone's booing, and now there's some chanting going on that's super inappropriate. And my son's asked me, what are they saying, Dad? I'm not going to repeat it, son. You ever been to a sporting event when the crowd loses its mind? You ever been to a music concert? You ever been to a political rally with someone who you think is smart, and then people start saying all these silly things? Crowds are foolish. Crowds turn on a dime. So Paul is under real pressure here. He turns, in the end of chapter 21, he turns to the Roman soldier and he changes his mind. He turns and speaks to the crowd in Aramaic and silences them. I mean, it's hard. It's hard for us to realize, like, how crazy is this? Paul has just been beaten. He convinces the Roman guard to let him speak. And then he turns to the crowd that has just beaten him and says, fathers and brothers, I got something to say. And they all go dead silent. That's courage. Where does that come from? You know, I think courage in the U.S. right now is denouncing people. Courage in the U.S. is keyboard warriors. Courage in the U.S. is pithy sayings that are a sentence long. Man, you're so bold on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter. Paul is offensive here, but he is not demonizing anyone. He is not defining love by destroying people. Remember what he says in Romans 9? I would rather be cut off from Christ for the sake of these people. So for the sake of the people who just beat me, I'm now going to share the love of Christ with them, even though they just beat me, and I'm not going to demean anybody. I'm not even going to attack them. Do you think he was afraid? Yes. A couple thousand people just tried to murder you. But what is he afraid of? I mean, he's seen the risen Jesus. There is something in his life that is now controlling him that makes him put all other fear in perspective. Do you think he's afraid of the crowd? Of course he's afraid of the crowd. Who wouldn't be afraid of the crowd? I'd be afraid of the crowd. I mean, what is courage? Courage is just overcoming fear, right? So what's he afraid of? Yes, he's afraid of the crowd. And it takes courage for him to tell the truth. You know, Paul will say in another place to the Corinthians, I came to you with fear and trembling so that your faith might not rest on men's wisdom, but God's power. You see, Paul used to see himself as God's big stick who just came and beat people into submission. And now he comes to the Corinthians and other places and says, what? I come to you in weakness. I come to you in fear. I come to you in trembling. I come to you essentially in the way of Christ. I come to you in love. You know, imagine you get disowned. A lot of you don't have to imagine this. You get disowned from your family because you've become a Christian. And then when you get together, you got to decide, am I going to fake unity or am I going to speak the name of Jesus even if it's offensive to people? There's the courage. But will I do it in a way that isn't angry and mad and attacking them and blaming them? we all need a little courage, right? You know, one of the most famous passages in the New Testament that people like to talk about in terms of talking with other people is found in 1 Peter. Peter says these words, revere Christ as Lord in your heart. Always be prepared to give an answer. If anyone asks you about the hope that's in you, did I just paraphrase that? I did. That is in you, but do it with gentleness and respect. You know, we focus on that, and everyone says, oh, this is apologetics, and you got to train for apologetics, and you got to know answers, and Paul was able to answer questions. I should be able to answer questions. But here's the thing you miss. People actually have to know you revere Christ and ask you something to be able to give them an answer. Has anyone ever asked you about your reverence for Christ? That's the apologetic, your life, and that's what Paul's using, his life. We're so big into defense. We're so big into attack. Has anyone just asked you a question because they saw that you're revering Jesus? And then in that moment, out comes the courage and kindness. You know, courage in the United States seems to be now. Are you willing to live out the implications of the gospel? If you notice in this passage in Acts 22, they're not mad at the resurrection. They're not mad in Jesus Messiah. They're mad in their ethnic hostility. They're mad about the implications of the gospel. You know, if you trace Paul, one thing you find is he doesn't always get in trouble for Jesus is raised from the dead, Jesus died on the cross. That's not the trouble. In some places it is, but in other places it's the implication that Gentiles and Jews are the same. In the last 100 years in the United States, being a Christian has been a gain. You can get a job. You can have people trust you. You gain friendships. But that time's coming to an end, I think. And it's the implications of the gospel on sexuality, on race, that are going to get you in trouble if you have courage. I mean, what is the issue that was the implication of the gospel that the church missed in the last 100 years? It was race, of course, right? And we think, oh yeah, I would be courageous. I would have been a abolitionist. If my church wouldn't have been part of that, one of my favorite Christian writers, Robert George at Princeton, asked his students these questions every semester. I asked them what their position on, say, slavery would be. You know, implication of the gospel. And surprise, surprise, if they were white in the South, they would all be abolitionists. They would all be brave. They would all work tirelessly. Of course, Robert George says, this is all nonsense. And so I asked them, have you ever taken a view that makes them unpopular with your peers, loathed by powerful, influential people, abandoned by friends who would speak nasty things of you at the risk of professional loss just because of your moral witness and the implication of the gospel? There's courage. It's not going to be, did Jesus rise from the dead or not? Everyone's like, okay, you can believe that, nice fairy tale. It'll be the implications, as it was for Paul. Courage doesn't mean you're not afraid. Courage is just what gets you over the hurdle. And I think you'll see courage in how Paul talks to these people in his strategy. So that's the story. There's courage. Here's the strategy. And you have a lot going on. Yes, this is a story. Yes, this is a repeat, but it's not the same. So in Acts 9, Acts 22, and Acts 26, we have Paul's testimony, and all three are different. So in Acts 9, you have Luke's version of it. Acts 22, you have Paul's version of it. Acts 26, you have Paul's version of it in front of someone else. And they're meant to be read cumulatively, but you see that Paul has a strategy in how he tells what God has done in his life. And he starts with, verse 1, brothers, listen to my defense. So this is his defense. How is he going to talk about Jesus to these people and interweave his life story? So strategy 1 for him is language and education. In 21 verse 37, so the Roman soldier kind of pulls him aside and he's about to interrogate him and throw him in jail. And Paul says, in formal, educated Greek, excuse me, may I say something to you? Now. Even today, we make initial judgments on people based on how they talk, right? And their accent. If you're from northern United States and you hear someone from the deep south, what do you think about them? Don't say it out loud. You know what you think about them. Automatic judgment. If you hear an Indian accent, you think things for good or bad. You hear someone from Central or South America, you hear things, you think something good or bad. From someone from Asia, you hear things, you think something good or bad. Same is true here. Paul turns to the Roman soldier and uses formal, educated Greek, and it throws him off. What? Wait, you speak Greek? He says. Verse 40 to 21 now, Paul motions to the crowd. That is a formal gesture of waving. Like, I'm a speaker, I know how to do this, and I'm now going to speak to you, and you're going to listen. Third, he speaks in Aramaic. Why is that important? Because all the Jews had dispersed. You know, when the temple was destroyed, not everyone comes back, and Ezra and Nehemiah, and they speak all sorts of languages. And now they're coming back in Jerusalem, and what is the language they're going to speak in Jerusalem? They're all going to speak Aramaic. And so what's Paul going to do? Is he going to speak Greek to these Jews? No, he's going to speak Aramaic. And what happens when he does? All of them are silent. I remember being in a church, a Korean missionary was speaking English, preaching in English, his second language, so that an Afghan whose English was third language, could translate that English message into Dari for the Afghans. And I remember just kind of looking around like, I wonder what the translation is that's happening right now. So the Korean speaks his second language, English, to the guy whose third language is English, who's translating into his first language, Dari. Why? Because English is the language everyone knew in that location. So that's what Paul's doing. He's speaking Aramaic. And then he goes to them respectfully. Verse 1, brothers and fathers, familial language. He's not attacking them. And so he gains a hearing. Thinking about this, he's about to be killed. The Romans are about to pull him away. And at the end of that, the very beginning, of the end of chapter 21, 22, he's got total control of the situation. Total control, because he uses his education, he uses his skill, he uses his formal Greek language, and then he uses Aramaic. What skills do you have that you can leverage for the sake of sharing the gospel with somebody? Strategy 2. I got to stop asking questions when you sit in the front row, buddy. Credentials. Why do you think Paul breaks them out? First thing he says, I'm a Jew. I have education. I studied under your top guy, and I was as zealous for God as you are. You know, in To Kill a Mockingbird, it's a story about a racially divided town through the eyes of this young girl, Scout. And in the middle of it, Atticus says to Scout, you never really understand a person until you consider things from their point of view, until you climb inside their skin and walk in it for a while. That's what Paul's doing here. I have walked in your skin. I have lived your life. I know you. I'm identifying with you. Everything you want, I am. The top teacher, I had him. City, I'm from the city everyone wants to be from. I studied in the city everyone wants to have. I am a Jew. I was a Pharisee. And I even persecuted the very people that you hate. He's trying to connect them with their experience. And then he does it again with Ananias. I went to Ananias. Ananias is respected. He's a devout observer to the law. Acts 9 doesn't have that. Why doesn't Acts 9 have it? Because it doesn't matter to Luke at that point, but it matters in Jerusalem. And so he's going there. The guy who called me brother and baptized me is highly respected by all the Jews and is a devout follower. What is he doing? He's building a bridge towards somebody. He's saying, look, here's my strategy. That's who you are. This is who I am. I'm going to try to walk towards you with my life and identify with who you are. How might you use your credentials that you've been given to talk to someone? And then the offense is at the end. The offense actually is one big offense, and it's not that Jesus died on the cross. It's not that he was resurrected. It's that Jews and Gentiles are the same. Offense number 1 is, I got baptized. Why is that an offensive? Because only Gentiles got baptized. And to say that a Jew needed to be baptized to wash their sins away was blasphemous. It was blasphemous for Paul to be baptized. And Paul's saying, I, a Jew, devout follower of the law, I had to be baptized just like the Gentiles. And then the second one, God had sent Paul to the Gentiles. And the gospel hits the core of their xenophobic sin. And you know, he even talks about it in the temple. I was in the temple. I fell into a trance. He told me to leave because you would not listen. Does that sound mildly offensive? Imagine someone coming up to you and saying, I was at the place at the center of your religious experience, and God told me you weren't going to listen, and so I left. Offensive? The Lord said, go, and I will send you far away. And then what happens? The crowd listened to Paul until he said that, and they raised their voices, rid the earth of him. He is not fit to live. So why is there a riot? Not because of the baptism, but because God would let Gentiles believe outside of becoming Jewish, and that was too much for them. And look at how mad they are. They're shouting, murder him, and they're throwing their clothes and kicking dust off. Now, I've read about 10 people on what is that, and no one knows. It essentially is bad. It's not a good situation. They want to kill him because Jews and Gentiles are equal. And so because of their ethnic pride, they turn their backs on the gospel. That's crazy. But that's been happening ever since. One of my favorite stories of this is the missionaries Ola and Minnie Hansen. Yes, they're Swedish. They were Swedish immigrants, and they were sent out by First Baptist Swedish Church of Minneapolis to Upper Burma, to the Kachin in 1890. So they're pioneer missionaries. And when they got there, the king of Burma said this to them. So you're to teach the Kachins? Do you see my dogs over there? They will more easily convert than the Kachin people. You are wasting your life. Well, he translated the New Testament by 1911, the Old Testament 1926, came back to the U.S. broken, poor, and died in Nebraska and didn't know what happened. Well, at the end of let's say 15 years ago, there were 400,000 to 500,000 Kachin Christians, almost all of them Baptist, all tracing their roots back to Ola and Minnie Hansen. The ones who looked the king of Burma in the eye and said, I'm not wasting my life going to those dogs. Story, courage, strategy. I thought maybe the best way to illustrate how this works is to tell you how I came to Christ. I say this because I think most of you don't know. And as you get to know people over long periods of time, if you don't kind of do it at the beginning, you actually don't know how people came to faith in Christ. And so I'm going to do it the Acts 9 version, and then I'm going to do one version as if I'm talking to one specific person. You can kind of figure out what kind of person I'm talking to. So I don't need notes for this, hopefully. I first encountered Christ in high school. In a liberal United Methodist church. And I mean liberal, I mean they now deny the resurrection of Jesus liberal. But they allowed an evangelical Christian to teach high school Sunday school class because they didn't have anybody, and they didn't ever check to see what he was teaching. He actually taught there for 20 years. There are two of us who became Christians, me and my prom date, who came to Christ years later. He taught a book called Letters from a Skeptic, which was letters back and forth between an atheist and a Christian. And it was his father's son, and the son is answering questions of his father. And every week he would hand us the one section, the atheist question. Every week we would go home, and I was just mentally riveted. So off to college I go, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. And at the end of the first semester, I bought all these Christian books. I didn't even know Christian bookstores existed. They don't exist anymore, but they did. Lifeway Christian Books. We go in, we buy all these books on apologetics, and I am a defender of the Christian faith. I get involved IV, I'm in leadership, I'm doing youth group at Spotswood Baptist Church. I actually go up to a camp after my junior year. I'm working at a Christian camp. Even after that, I get discipled by Ed Hart, this pastor who sits me down, and his first question is, listen to me. Darren, how do you live the Christian life? And don't quote any of those books you're reading. Just tell me in your own words. And I couldn't answer him. I even entered a discipleship program. And I remember sitting in a lean-to in the Adirondacks, and I realized in that moment that I had learned to defend Jesus, but I didn't actually love him. That I loved to quote people defending him, but I couldn't actually quote him myself. And in that moment, I was saved. And 2 days later, I was baptized in the Sacandaga River. And my life was dramatically changed. Those are the facts. Now rewind it. I grew up in a church and I don't remember caring. I do remember at the end of high school wanting to know answers to my questions, and I joined a Bible study in IV, this Christian ministry, and the Christian faith became hold. And I went home after my first semester and I bought these 20 books, but I'm not sure if I actually believed it because my life was an absolute disaster. I was lying all the time. I had no integrity. And I would meet with people and they didn't like me and I couldn't figure out why. I was so arrogant. I was so proud. People were repulsed by me. But I didn't realize it. I even went to a Christian discipleship program to further my faith because I thought I was so serious. And in that time, I realized I wasn't serious. I didn't know the Lord at all. And all that stuff behind the scenes came out, and my life was dramatically changed in my repentance. And if you don't believe me, ask the girl who was sitting next to me. I married her. She saw it. And now I offer that life to you. See what I'm doing now? Jesus doesn't offer you middle ground. I can talk to you about, you want to talk about depression, I can talk to you about that. You want to talk about a life with athletics in the background, I could talk to you about that. You want to talk about growing up in the Washington, D.C., I don't want to talk to you about that. Okay, I could give you credential after credential based on who you are and where you are in your life to try